2025 will be the year of the rise of the edges. Or maybe in 2025, the edge will be the new cloud. This is some of our predictions Dr. Scott Gerard and I are making in that new episode of the IoT Show. We'll talk about what happened in 2024 that really marked our industry and our domain. And we'll talk about our predictions. What's going to happen in 2025? We'll talk regulation, security, AI, and more. If you like this episode, as usual, don't forget to give us a little like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell to get notified. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. This is Olivier here. You're watching the IoT Show. Today, we want to talk about 2025 resolutions when it comes to the edge. And for that, we'll look at 2024. What are the big things that happen at the edge in IoT? And for that, we have Scott Gerard with us. Dr. Scott Gerard. Hey, how are you, Scott?
I'm great. I'm Scott Gerard. I've been working in the IT industry for years and years and years. And I've more recently taken a particular focus on AI and IoT together, so AIoT. But that pulls in the edges, which is what we're going to talk about here today.
Exactly. Yeah. So AIoT is that new term that we are hearing more and more that allows to have AI in the keyword for SEOs to find us. That's the way I qualify that word. But it does make sense. Bringing the AI, in the IoT realm at the edge is something that we've seen a lot in 2024. So that actually triggers my first question to you, Scott. So what are the main events, the main things that happen in the realm of IoT or at the edge over the last year from your perspective?
One of the ones that I think we all remember was the CrowdStrike debacle that happened. And the reason I think it's particularly important for the edge is because the CrowdStrike people screwed up. There's no question. They made a bug in their software and everything crashed. There was like 8 million devices that had to be rebooted, had to be manually touched to be rebooted. And you can blame them, and of course we should to a degree, but hey, we're all software developers. We're all going to make mistakes at some point or another. And so you say, well, gee, maybe it's the Microsoft guys because they allowed CrowdStrike to get in at this super deep layer. Well, it turns out that they were required by legislation to open that thing up, which also suggests that maybe some of the regulations that people are talking about aren't as well thought through as they really ought to be. But it really suggests that we need to take very careful caution on deploying devices that are, in pipelines. They may be up in trees. They may be underwater. If that happened to one of your devices and you had to go touch all of those, that'd have been a total disaster. So we need to I think everybody knows that we need to have, rock solid software, but this very, very base layer with installable software, it has to be super doubly, triply.
There's so much to unpack from that CrowdStrike, event or debacle, as I like to call it. You mentioned some of them. The fact that there's so many actors in play, the Microsoft, the airports and the airlines and, CrowdStrike themselves. Like now, a system that is connected is not just about, one vendor that implements that solution end to end. It's many different technologies implemented and integrated by different vendors and makes it even more complicated. And you touch on a few things, but that whole event also reminded me of something that happened a long time ago in my career. Yeah. That is somewhat related. There's this gas distribution company in UK that wanted to have smart fuel pumps and a display where they could have interactive content, or not so much interactive because the screen was not a touch screen at the time, where the technology was not there yet for that. So these screens were displaying ads and information to the customers while they were refueling. And these machines were equipped with some OS, and they forgot to think about daylight changing time, where a specific day, a pop-up appeared asking for the user, we are about to change to daylight saving. Do you confirm that you want to change, on a UI with no touchscreen? And so they had to send maintenance people, to every single fuel pump out there to plug in a USB keyboard and click accept, because they didn't have any way to remotely access these machines, manage them from there, at least from the UI perspective. Reboot would do nothing because you will still have the pop-up coming up, and they didn't really think about the software and how it should have been designed and tested to be used in that context. And I thought, well, CrowdStrike certainly had even more impact. And was like even more scary in terms of how intrusive, how disruptive this was. But I think it's related, and it comes down to how you design your embedded software at the edge to be able to, at some level, be autonomous, not require a human interaction, or also eventually have the tools in place to emit the signals that something is going wrong, or plan for the worst case, basically. Isn't that right?
Exactly. I was just reading something recently about Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, the spacecraft. They launched them in 1977 with an expected 4-year life. It's been 45 years. They're still going strong. And, there is no going out and touching those devices anymore. They are traveling at high speeds for 45 years. They've actually left the solar system. The people that designed those did a great job of, they allowed software updates, which was really critical, but the hardware, it was fixed, and it still is. And it's still running on 8-track tape.
You know what? Like, don't fix something that works.
Right.
That's a good motto, especially in our domain where sometimes equipment are here to last for 10, 20 years. So back to, the marking events of 2024 at the edge. There's a couple more that we, when we were preparing for this episode, that we mentioned. One is regulations. Cyber Resilience Act in Europe is something that everyone has been talking about during 2024. What's your take on the announcement and the deployment of this new regulation in Europe and in the US at some point, as there will be an impact, right?
And it's not just that act. There's also the EU Data Act. The EU AI Act was just passed into law, and it took effect in August of this year. The requirements won't necessarily kick in for a year or two, but people need to be designing their devices in relation to this. And it's not just, I don't ever plan to deploy in Europe. If EU citizens are using your device, then you're impacted by it. And I think far too many of us, the engineering world, at least the computer science guys, have been without, a lot of certifications and regulations for most of our lives here. And that's great, but that's changing. And people need to be thinking about these regulations now to prepare for what's coming.
Yeah, and that's for the better, because these regulations are meant to secure these systems. Despite the vendors who want to add functionality, sell more services, but they have now constraints that are meant to make these systems more secure, more resilient. So that's for the better at the end of the day, right? Constraints are not always bad. Guardrails are here for reasons, not to jump off a cliff, for example. Would not be good. Another thing that, we cannot not talk about AI in general and Gen AI in particular. So what have you seen in the past year that really, impacted the IoT realm when it comes to AI, if anything, besides the buzz?
Well, the hype around generative AI is at an all-time high. In Gartner's hype cycle, generative AI was at the absolute peak of overinflated expectations. And I think it deservedly belongs there. We'll talk more about that later. But there are some cracks that are beginning to form in the whole generative AI place. OpenAI has seen their paid subscriptions drop substantially. And the only thing I can think of is people played with it for a year or two, had a lot of fun, but a lot of them are like, I'm going back to my day job. So their revenue was dropping. They're having to run bigger and bigger models. They were supposed to be running a $5 billion deficit this year alone. They did get some infusion of cash for that. So that's kind of a crack forming. The
That's
other cracks that people are talking about is the thought was, if I could build a bigger model if I had more data, just more and more data, I can train bigger and bigger models. There's a lot of people beginning to question that. Some of the newer models that have been coming out this year haven't been scaling like people expected them to. So there's some cracks forming, and we'll talk about that some more in the next section.
Yeah, definitely. And the buzz generated around generative AI is something that, in my opinion, benefited what I call boring AI, AI that is meant to be practical and useful, delivers actual outcomes. And in our domains, in our industries, I can see things that will rely on AI or are already relying on AI for doing predictive maintenance, for doing vision AI at the edge. Edge AI is something we're talking, and we've been talking more and more in 2024 in the little world of IoT, edge, OT, and so on. And I think the buzz around Gen AI generated that because execs, decision makers, all came in like, hey, can I have AI in my product? Not really understanding what that meant. But we say, yeah, we do have something called TinyML. We do have things that allow bringing machine learning models all the way down to sensors, to little devices that are at the edge. And it kind of like, put some more oomph into that kind of projects, these kind of technologies. And so I think that's one of the things I noticed in 2024. The generative AI conversation led to more interesting conversation about that boring AI thing at the edge. And indeed, we'll talk more about that when it comes to the next chapter of our conversation, which is our predictions for 2025. The 2024 like big CrowdStrike debacle and really revealed two things, right? IoT is everywhere, and we depend on it. And the edge is key and super important. The dependence on the cloud and the connectivity might be a weak link or a problem. And you need regulations. You need to pay attention to how you're deploying your systems and designing them. And AI. These are the two main things that, yes, indeed, we can sum up as the big events in 2024. Now, let's turn to 2025. What are your predictions for what will happen at the edge in 2025? So we're not talking like 5-10 years from now, like next year. What's going to happen?
I think to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork for this discussion, I like the idea of multi-agent systems. I've done a lot of work in that, and I think it's really important. A lot of people are talking about agentic AI, and that's cool, but there are multi-agent systems that have nothing to do with generative AI as well. So the way to think of it, I think, is that there's a lot of locations, a lot of computer locations, I like to call them venues, where you can run software. The
Mhm.
cloud is a venue, but there's also what I call on-premise edge, right? It's probably a little bit of a beefier computer. If it's in the home, it's maybe a Raspberry Pi or something a little bit more. If it's a manufacturing floor, it could be a whole server rack or whatever.
Mhm.
But that's a venue where you can run stuff. And you can even run it out all the way to some of the devices, right? Running optical character or optical recognition on cameras or audio recognition on microphones. That all makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So AI though can run in any of those locations as long as you have enough bandwidth or enough compute resources, right? So we can run this stuff in the cloud, and most people start there. But you can also run it on premise, which I think is where a lot of the generative AI really belongs when you go out to the edge. I don't think a large language model running on a small, tiny device makes that much sense, to be honest. What you want to do is you want to make sure that that on-premise device, that home, that manufacturing facility can run by itself. My
Okay.
friend likes to call it armadillo mode, right? If the rest of the world crashes, maybe because of CrowdStrike, maybe because of something else, my local area can continue to run for like 3 days. That's usually enough to get past most of the things. Maybe you want to go a little longer, but I think that's the way to do it. And this armadillo mode is an idea that I think more of us should have, on our list of our checklist of things to look for.
Yeah, I'm hearing three things in what you just said. Like,
Mhm.
let me see if I heard correctly and summarize that correctly as well. We're talking about seeing more distributed systems at the edge. So the intelligence would be spreading across the edge and no longer be something that belongs to the cloud with, dumb sensors and actuators at the edge. So distribution was maybe beefier machines, gateways, equipment that will have, an orchestration role, something like that, and then a dispatch of that intelligence in the form of, small language models or tiny ML that will be running here and there. Totally, I'm with you 100% on this one. The autonomous one is interesting. So, like, I wouldn't say autonomous, but maybe the ability to resist or survive an offline situation or be designed for it. I think that's super important. We often think about this as the disconnected scenario for something that is moving, like a cruise ship, right, where you have to, because at the end of the day you will lose your connection to cellular or whatever at some point when you get offshore, and so you need to consider that and take that into account. But we're seeing that as well as a requirement for facilities and systems that could be connected all the time but don't want to, or for security reasons ought to be disconnected most of the time, or firewalled in a way that you only have one little tiny connection where you have a very controlled type of data that is going through. Definitely, that's the second big one, and AI in general being optimized for the edge. That's the way I like to say any form of AI. Yeah, definitely these three big trends, I definitely concur with you, are happening. I'm seeing another interesting one, which relates to the distribution of intelligence. There is I would say, it's not something really new, but I can see in 2025 that becoming the norm, which is the appearance of these heavier edge devices. Manufacturing is leading in that space. Like there are equipments, field buses that you don't want to connect directly to the internet, whether because it's like brownfield, it's old technology and it's hard to consider like changing a firmware or adding network connectivity, cellular or whatever, on an old piece of hardware to make it connected. And so you're going to add a box in between, like we used to call that gateway, but these gateways are becoming more functional. They can now do some filtering on the data. They can transform and enrich that data. They can build these pipelines. They can run AI where you would not even have any compute or whatever. And so these boxes or systems that are just starting to arrive they started arriving in the last few years. I can see companies like Litmus Edge that is really having a good time because they have a really good business model and a really nice offering that allows industrials to modernize their equipment without compromising with security and this kind of things. Microsoft just talked about Azure Local, which allows to bring some of that Azure infrastructure at the edge. So these are things that to me will be really important in 2025 and will really like pick up steam, and AI will be a motivation to run AI at the edge. You need to have this kind of hardware that is more capable. And you need also to be able to retrofit existing equipment, adding hardware, adding new components to systems.
One of the other elements of this whole multi-agent idea is think about a general and a platoon leader. The general doesn't dictate every single decision that the platoon leader makes. They're disconnected oftentimes. The
Mhm.
same thing is true for a CEO and people, programmers in the trenches. I've often heard that the CEOs only have certain levers that they can control, but they have delegated that responsibility, that autonomy, those decisions down to the the platoon leader or the people in the field. And I think that's a great model to have in mind. AI enables us to put enough intelligence down there with the platoon leader to do his things. That's what AI gives you. And so when you do become disconnected, either in a planned or unplanned scenario, you're ready to go.
Yeah, so it becomes a very smart armadillo, basically.
Very smart armadillo. That's right.
protected from the outside. Okay, Scott. So we talked in introduction about regulations, right? The fact that some new regulations popped up and that people are starting to talk about them and they already are adopted down there or back there in Europe. How do you think it's going to impact 2025 and IoT in general or the edge in general in 2025?
Well, Europe is really leading the whole world on these things. I mean, they have done a lot of work on some regulations. I've heard both good things and bad things about it. Doesn't really matter, right? Those are the regulations. And like we mentioned earlier, it's not just that if you're going to deploy to Europe, you have to be concerned. If you're going to ever touch an EU citizen, you have to be concerned. My suspicion is that most US people aren't really paying near enough attention to that set of possibilities. We need to get much more involved, much more understanding what it is those regulations require, whether or not they impact your particular device that you're building or the devices that you're deploying is a separate question. But you need to have at least considered all of these things before you just launch ahead and say, well, I've never had to do that before. I just don't think that's good enough. I think the US, from a regulatory position, is very much laissez-faire, very much behind the curve on this. California, not so much. There's some stuff happening in New York as well, but the U.S. I think is going to lay back and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But we all need to be concerned about it because these IoT devices are going to be collecting huge volumes of data, and the EU Data Act is all about what we're doing with data. The AI Act, what are we doing with our AI? Are you disadvantaging a particular sex? Are you disadvantaging a particular race? Are you disadvantaging someone else? There's a lot of interesting ways that all that can come into place. The whole ProPublica thing with the Compass AI that was doing sentencing guidelines, right? The guys that did this had a good case to make to say that we weren't biased, but ProPublica looked at it a different way, and it became obvious that in those metrics it was a problem. So, just something that we got to put on your checklist.
Definitely. It has to be on the 2025 checklist. Not just pay attention or check, but we've seen that with GDPR, where Europe implemented it, and then suddenly US realized that, oh, wait a second, so I'm doing business there, so maybe I should pay attention. Oh, maybe I should be compliant. Actually,
yeah. There's another topic I ran across. This whole thing of post-quantum cryptography. People have related it to the Y2K problem, that in Y2K, we know that particular day, the systems were going to probably fail. And so we had 7-8 years to really plan on that. We don't know when quantum computers will be able to break the cryptographic protocols that are currently in use today. But I've heard suggestions of 3 to 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
If your IoT device is still going to be in market in that time, you probably need to be thinking about that now. I don't know what the answer is, but that's another potentially big gotcha coming at us.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that one. We need to design systems to be resilient, not just from the perspective of being able to run disconnected, but also from the perspective of being able to evolve to the next level of encryption, next level of communication. So we need to think about our systems and solutions as flexible, entities that will evolve with their time. And technologies are evolving so much faster these days that it's hard to predict, right? It's something that I was talking to a friend of mine who is in facilities, and on the Microsoft campus, we're talking about, that there was a time where they were building that new campus that is now in place, and they were thinking about EV charging stations for the parking lot. And the thinking, and it was like a few years ago, was like, hey, like in a few years from now, everyone will have an EV. How about we put a charging plug on every single car or parking spot? And they thought about it. Well, they thought about the economics of it. Like, well, that's going to be expensive. But then they realized something, which is like, you know what? In 5, 10 years from now, EVs will have an autonomy such that people won't need to recharge every time they're parked somewhere. So they will charge at home, right? And then they'll come to work, and like with their gas or with their ICE engine car, they don't need to refuel or recharge because they have plenty enough, right? So now they'll end up with having to maintain charging stations for like, I don't know how many thousand parking spots that will not be used. And so trying to imagine what the future will be is hard, but you have to account for things that evolve, and technology evolves super fast. And so 2025 is no exception, especially with the next topic, which is AI. AI coming really hard into solutions from the angle of Gen AI, but as I was mentioning, is already present in the form of that boring AI, useful AI, AI that is about doing that predictive maintenance, anomaly detections, that is used today in security systems. We're talking about security. AI, for me, has a very nice use in the realm of IoT to detect anomalies on a network, on a system. Something is not behaving as it should, and I can see a little tiny trend of changing data sizes and things like that could trigger alerts for someone to go investigate further and discover that, hey, there is a little Trojan horse has been installed on that server down there, or something like that. So AI in 2025, how do you see that evolving? So lots of buzz in 2024. What's going to happen in 2025 from your perspective?
Another thing that I think is important for people to remember, and for some people to know, is that generative AI is out there and it's cool, no question about that. But there's 70 years of other AI developments that have been done, and the whole predictive maintenance thing that you're talking about, a lot of that can be done without generative AI. So there's these two camps, if you will, of AI applications. And don't get locked into thinking I have to use generative AI, because it has value in some senses, in some cases, but like it doesn't reason. It doesn't reason well at all, particularly complex reasoning. Even Sam Altman will tell you that. So that's one thing to know. The second thing is, with the generative AI, we talked about the cracks forming. For those of you who know the Gartner hype curve, there's the peak of overinflated expectations, and then there's this trough of disillusionment. I think we're headed into the trough in 2025. The cracks are already beginning to come up. We've got hallucinations. We've got unsustainable energy costs. A lot of things going on. People are just going to get more realistic. They're gonna get off the hype, and they're going to say it does hallucinate. I don't want to use it in places where these hallucinations could cause me, legal, financial, reputational kind of risks, right? So there's that part of it. Like I said, I think the generative AI for IoT in particular, if you're running it on a camera or you're running it on a microphone, yeah, I can see it maybe there. But I do think we need to be realistic about those devices are too constrained to run 7 billion, 14 billion, parameter models. They're just not equipped for that. But you don't need it either. This is where this on-premise edge, this beefier device, I think, comes in. You and I talked about at one point, I want to use a large language model to help me understand, why did my device fail? Here's the symptoms I have. Can you help me understand what's going on?
Yeah.
That's a great thing to do. I actually would like it to not be in the cloud because of a CrowdStrike problem. I would like it to be on premise. But that one beefy thing on premise can run those models, and it can run them for all your devices. And that makes perfect sense. Again, that the agent on that beefy device is the agent that's responsible for understanding how to fix things and what can go wrong and how to look through the documentation.
Yeah.
The devices themselves, they don't need that kind of function.
And then you can also work on these language models to build smaller ones that are specialized on a subset of the internet and not on all of it, and being specialized on a specific set of machines to make them even more powerful, useful for operators, because they will interact now with a system that will know, how to instruct the operator to fix it. So you will maybe not need to do a call to support and have someone come over, because that someone knows that machine better than anyone else. Now you can talk to that machine and have it tell you, hey, open that panel there, look at these wires, like look at this thing, it seems it's loose, or something like that. And the operator will be able, in a natural language, to interact with that machine, but the machine will not be entering about, the last game's results, or where to invest stocks. That
Exactly.
entity will respond to questions related to that machine. So I think there's something there.
I also think it's important for user adoption. It's really fun for us technologists to build these devices and then push them out and say, you guys have to figure out how to use them now. The guys on the floor, they don't see it that way typically, right? And we need to make sure we're focused on adoption. And so having this stuff on the floor where they can touch it if they want to or need to will increase their ability to adopt it and their eagerness to adopt it.
Sure. Think about the actual scenario. Is there a use case before even building the technology? I think this is a rule of thumb that we've forgotten about as technologists, which actually accelerates innovation in one way, because like we are building lots of useless things, and one of them out of like 1,000 of them is maybe useful and will basically be the one. But yeah, think about the outcome and the actual use and use case before building something. I think is one of the things we'll talk about during the call to action, I guess. So one last thing about AI at the edge. So one way I like to talk about AI, and explain AI, especially to people who are not in technology, is to tell them it's all about probability. An AI model is about determining what's the highest probability that this or that is true, or happens, what not. And so, do you want really to give to an AI system the keys of a critical system? Something that needs to be deterministic, something that needs 100% certainty on, hey, something is wrong. When I'm going to press on that red button, I have 100% certainty that it will stop the machine. Not like press the button and the system will say, well, maybe the temperature is not that high, so I don't need to stop that thing. Or maybe you don't want that. You really want something that you can trust. Do you think we'll get to a point where AI will become trustworthy enough to run at the edge on critical systems?
Yes, qualified yes. And you talked about probabilistic systems, right? Those are Bayesian models. That's one of these non-generative technologies. LLMs don't do Bayesian calculations. The calculations for probability are very prescribed as exactly how you compute these probabilities. And
Mhm.
LLMs just don't do that. So if what I do see is that the LLMs can be a user interface to some of these other algorithms, these more traditional algorithmic, deterministic, provable, correct systems.
Mhm.
And so that's important, but there's still this piece where the LLMs can hallucinate in there. And it's kind of concerning. We can put in guardrails, but to be honest, we don't know why or how LLMs can do some of the cool things they do. I mean, the developers don't understand it really yet, right? Um, which
True.
is a little concerning. If you have um, uh, some applications, some use cases where hallucinations aren't really a problem, super. But if you're in the medical field or you're running a factory floor, that can get to be a little bit different. So you have to figure out what you're going to do if and when it does hallucinate.
Yeah.
When you talked about giving, today most LLMs, they're multimodal, but let's wave our hands at that. An LLM is text to text, right? There's
Yeah.
a new kind of model that's coming on called a large action model, and it's text to action. So you say, shut down the plant, right? That's a text input, and the LLM will convert it into, I need to call these APIs on my lower level deterministic sort of software, and it goes off and shuts it down. What if it doesn't shut it down? Or what if it doesn't shut it all down or refuses it?
Mhm.
These are the trustworthy things that we have to worry about. the correctness. Um, we're not, like I said, we're not so interested in gender differences or racial differences or those kind of things, but just hallucinations outright could be, they have to be seriously considered. Don't
Yeah.
just wave your hands at it.
Yeah, I'm not even like getting started on all the science fiction movies that predicted, the uh, the rise of AI that will take over and get rid of humanity. I hope we have the three rules of Asimov into all these AI systems. I hope someone thought about it at some point, right?
You know what kills me about some of those movies? The ones that I hate is, the hero and his little troop band of regulars are surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of these drones or whatever, and they're going to attack them. And they always come up and they say, well, all we have to do is find the master one and kill it, and all the rest of them will die. It's like multi-agent system says, BS. That is not the way we're going to design our systems. Each one of those is capable to do enough to kill the hero, right?
That's yeah.
There may be other systems that are deciding whether to kill him or whether not to, but those aren't the ones that you're worried about. So
Yeah, that's a good point actually, and that circles back to this notion of distributing the intelligence and having edge systems being designed to be resilient and to survive worst case scenarios. So that's definitely something that people need to keep in mind. It's 2025, Scott. So it's time for new resolutions. What are the edge resolution for 2025? What are the main ones?
I think we've touched on most of them here. One is to plan for resiliency and offline operations. That's kind of the whole armadillo mode. Um, you need to be thinking about regulations. What regulations could impact you and which ones can you ignore? And we've talked about exploiting AI at the edge. I mean, edge and cloud are no longer, senior junior relationship. I think they're equal to each other, and the edge can do a whole lot of stuff all by itself. The cloud adds value, but it isn't the only place to add value.
Nice.
Um,
And maybe I can use AI to help me in my resolution to lose weight and do sports again, right?
that's probably a little less likely to happen, but
And AI that I have in there, right?
that's
Actually,
true. That's
right.
true.
There you go. There you go. Scott, that was awesome. Thank you very much. Hopefully, people will look at the year to come or the year that has already started for Edge as being full of promises. And I'm one of the people convinced that the Edge is taking off in a way that we've not seen before, and we'll see lots of innovation in that space. And hope to have you again on the show soon, Scott, because that was very enlightening and very interesting conversation that we had.
This was a great conversation, Olivier. And I am also very optimistic about Edge and AI for 2025.
Awesome. Everyone, thanks for tuning in today and see you soon. Bye.